When I was in college, I rented a small studio apartment on the ground floor of a 3-story building. It was nothing fancy, just a one-room space with a kitchenette, a small bathroom, and a big window that looked out onto the street. I lived there alone, and it was my first time truly being on my own. I was working part-time and taking night classes, so I'd usually get home pretty late, around 9 or 10 p.m. The neighborhood wasn't bad, but it was quiet. Almost too quiet. My street was lined with trees and only had a few street lights, which made the sidewalk outside my window feel a bit eerie at night. One night I got home later than usual. I had stayed behind after class to finish a group project and didn't walk in until almost 11. I tossed my bag on the couch, kicked off my shoes, and started microwaving leftovers. I remember the exact moment it started. I had just sat down with my food when I heard a knock on the window. Not a tap, a knock. I froze. Who knocks on a window at 11 at night? At first, I thought maybe it was a neighbor or someone who needed help. But when I slowly walked over and peeked through the blinds, I felt my stomach turn. There was a man standing outside, just standing, not saying anything. He was wearing a hoodie pulled tight over his face and dark pants. I couldn't make out any details, just his shape, the faint outline of his hands at his sides, and the fact that he was definitely staring directly at me. I backed away from the window, heart racing. I didn't want to call 911 in case it was just some weird misunderstanding, but I also didn't want to ignore it. Then came another knock. Louder this time, more aggressive. I flipped off the lights in the apartment, hoping he'd just leave. I stood there in the dark, behind the couch, trying not to breathe too loudly. He knocked again, and again, and again. I finally grabbed my phone and called my friend James, who lived a few blocks away. He picked up quickly and I whispered what was going on. He told me to stay on the line, to stay hidden, and that he was on his way. While I was on the phone, I peeked through the blinds again. The man was gone. At first, I felt relief, but then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The front door handle was moving, very slowly, carefully, like someone was testing to see if it was unlocked. I ran to the door and deadbolted it, just as the handle jerked violently. Someone was definitely trying to get in. I screamed into the phone that he was at the door, and James shouted that he was turning the corner. A few seconds later, I heard someone sprinting away from my door. James showed up less than a minute later. We searched outside, but the man was gone. No footprints, no sign of him. I moved out 2 weeks later. Whoever that was, they knew I was home alone, and I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't locked that door in time. A few years ago, my cousin Ava invited me to house sit while she and her husband went on vacation for a week. Their house was out in the countryside, surrounded by trees and farmland, beautiful during the day, but unsettling at night. They had a big farmhouse with creaky floors, high ceilings, and a weirdly dark basement. I only had to feed the cats, water the plants, and make sure nothing burned down. Easy enough. The first couple of nights were quiet. I read books, watched movies, and sat on the back porch drinking tea while the crickets chirped. But on the third night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a strange sound. It was soft at first, a dull thumping. I figured it was just the cats, but when I sat up and looked around, I saw both of them sleeping peacefully on the chair in the corner. That's when I heard it again. Thump. This time louder, like a boot hitting wood. It was coming from downstairs, more specifically, from the basement. I stayed still for a long time listening. It didn't repeat. Eventually, I told myself it was probably just the old pipes or the wind. It was an old house after all. The next night, around the same time, I heard it again. Thump, thump, thump. And then a dragging sound. It sounded like something or someone was slowly dragging something heavy across the basement floor. That's when I decided to call Ava. I didn't want to freak her out, but I told her I kept hearing strange noises at night and asked if there was any chance someone else had a key or had been staying in the basement. She laughed it off and said the basement always made noises, but no one else had access, just to keep the doors locked and ignore it. That night, I locked every door and window. I double-checked the basement door too, which thankfully had a deadbolt. But around 3 a.m., I was woken by the sound of whispering. Low, deep, whispering coming from the vent beside my bed. I leaned in and could hear a voice, maybe more than one, murmuring something I couldn't make out. I froze, barely able to breathe. Then I heard it again. Thump, from the basement. This time I didn't investigate. I locked myself in the guest room and stayed up until dawn with a knife in hand. When Ava came back, I told her everything. She looked pale, and for a long time she didn't speak. Finally, she admitted that ever since they moved in, they heard the same noises too, but only when the house was completely quiet. And the weirdest part, they don't have any vents in the basement. When I was 10 years old, my family moved to a small town in the middle of nowhere. Our new house was nice enough, a 2-story home with a big backyard surrounded by woods on 2 sides. But the thing I remember most was the old wooden shed behind the house. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The wood was gray and cracked, the roof sagged, and there were vines crawling up the sides. My parents told me not to go near it. It wasn't safe and it was full of old junk and possibly mold. So naturally, I was obsessed with it. I used to play in the yard and stare at it, imagining what was inside. One day, while I was playing with my soccer ball, it rolled behind the shed. When I went to get it, I heard something that made me stop. A voice, a little boy's voice. It sounded like he was whispering my name. I ran back to the house, terrified. My mom told me it was probably the wind, but she looked uneasy when I told her exactly what I heard. A few nights later, I woke up around 1 a.m. and saw a movement outside my window. I peeked through the blinds and saw a small figure standing by the shed. It was a boy. He was just staring at the house, not moving, not blinking. I told my dad and he went outside with a flashlight, but by the time he got there, the boy was gone. There were no footprints, no sign anyone had been there. This kept happening for weeks. I'd see the boy, always at night, always by the shed, but he never came closer. One day I finally worked up the nerve and went behind the shed in broad daylight. I pulled open the old creaky door, and inside was nothing but rotten tools, spider webs, and broken furniture. But carved into the wall, scratched deep into the wood, was a name. It was my name, repeated over and over again, as if someone had been obsessively etching it into the wall for years. My parents had the shed torn down 2 days later, and we never saw the boy again.